So, one of the things that's hard to do for any gospel preacher or anyone that has the opportunity to speak on a regular basis is to find material and come up with material that can continue to keep people interested, keep them informed. There's so much of it out there. It's just a matter of finding that material and figuring out how best to present it. And as I was kind of going through and considering what I would like to speak on, I came across something that just said lessons from the life of Samson. And I kind of thought about it a little bit, and I really can't think of a time off the top of my head that I can recall hearing a sermon preached about Samson. I can think of all kinds of Bible classes and learning about the strong man and various things like that and studying Samson in Bible class, but I thought it might be interesting to go back and to take a look at the life of Samson. And this was originally kind of going to be a character study on who he is and maybe looking at his various attributes and things like that. But as I got into the study of Judges, the 13th through the 16th chapters, I started to realize that rather than doing a character study per se, there are a lot of different points that we can pull from the account of the life of Samson. And so what we're going to do is kind of go through the 13th through the 16th chapter, and we're just going to take pieces of some of the information that exists in Judges chapters 13 verse 16, and we're going to try to learn some life lessons. The first thing that I notice is the attitude of his parents and the type of attitude maybe that parents today might want to have as well. First, in looking at his mother, we find out, as is common at times in Scripture, when God chooses a woman to bear a child for a specific plan that he has, she was barren. But she was told by a man of God that she would have a child. And she believed without question, and she raised this child as God commands her to do. In Judges chapter 13, focusing on verses 6 and 7, it says, "So the woman came and told her husband, saying, A man of God came to me, and his countenance was like the countenance of the angel of God, very awesome. But I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name. And he said to me, Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now drink no wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death." And so the first thing that she's told she's going to have a son. And the second thing she's told is how she's going to raise that son. And she doesn't question the man of God. She doesn't stop and inquire any further really of the man of God. She takes the information at its value, and she immediately goes and she tells her husband this fact that she is now aware of. She has no question in her mind that what she was told by the man of God was truth, and she believed without question. When we look at Samson's father, we see right away he's concerned about bringing up the child in the right way. In verse 8, after he hears that they're going to have a child, it says, "Then Manoah prayed to the Lord and said, O my Lord, please let the man of God whom you sent come to us again and teach us what we shall do for the child who will be born." And I stop and I think about that, and I think, wouldn't it be great today if all of the fathers and mothers out there as well had this idea that they need to go to God in order to learn how the child should be raised, what we should do for the child. So many times, I think, in the world today, people become fathers almost haphazardly, and they don't really have a great concern as to how that child should be raised. For Manoah, for the father of Samson, his initial thought immediately was, I need to know and I need to look to God to find out how I should raise this child. In verse 12, as we look a little bit further, Manoah said, Now let your words come to pass. What will be the boy's rule of life in his work? So he's already taking an interest in the life of his son. He's already showing an interest in what the boy will do, what his work will be, and this is before his son is even born. And how great, again, would it be if fathers showed that same type of interest in the children that they were rearing and bringing up? I think we would see a very different society than what exists in the world today. The second thing that I think that we can pull out from the 13th through the 16th chapters or take a look at is the idea of the importance of choosing a spouse. In chapter 14 and verses 1 through 3, we read, Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren, or among all my people, that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. Again, as I look at this passage and I think about the world today, I think we see a lot of this where we don't have the same situation where you tell mom and dad, go get this woman for me because that's who I want as a wife. But in a lot of instances, we have people who say, this particular person pleases me well, regardless of what mom and dad may think, regardless of their background, regardless of whether or not they have the same belief system that we do, whether or not they have the same goals in mind in life that we do. We just have this idea of, oh, well, this person pleases me, so this is what I'm going to do, without taking the time to listen to the advice of our parents. And as I think about this, I think it's good to put a warning out there. And I don't believe anywhere in the Bible that you can say that it specifically states that a Christian cannot marry a non-Christian. It doesn't say that. Now, one of the things that I would suggest to anyone is, as you are going into considering a relationship, as you are considering your future, I would encourage you to think about the fact that if you can't agree on what is supposed to be the most important thing in your life, then I ask you, how well do you think that marriage is going to go? Or at least, how easy do you think that marriage is going to be? Now, it can be done, and certainly there is no sin in marrying a non-Christian. My encouragement to people is to take the time and the opportunity as they are dating to invite the one that they may be interested in and may see as future potential, that they invite them to study and learn about God and the importance of His church in your life, and to see how they react to that and whether or not that's something that one day they may be interested in. So I think it's important in regards to choosing a spouse that one really think about everything that's involved. Think about whether or not they have the same belief system, whether or not they have the same goals in life, the same desires. Think about what your parents have to say about this particular individual, and be willing to listen to and accept potential advice from those parents as to whether or not you are making the right decision. Now, in this particular case, I do understand if you look onto verse 4, in the account of Judges and in the account with Samson, it does say, "But his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel." So in this particular case, this was a part of God's overall plan. And again, we can't always account for what it is that God's plan is going to be. And again, his ways may not always be our ways, nor his thoughts our thoughts. But I believe there is something that we can consider from this text. The third thing that I think we could point out is that there is value in avoiding strong drink. And the question of, is it a sin to drink alcohol? Is it a sin only if you get drunk? Is it, this whole question and this whole idea of whether or not it's a sin or where the sin lies, I think that we can set all of that aside, and I think we can learn things maybe from a little bit different perspective as far as the idea of, it's the drunkenness, or, it's if you have a single sip. Here we can see the value of avoiding strong drink, and I want you to kind of consider how this comes about. First of all, his mother was told not to drink wine or anything similar. Now, we understand today that the use of alcoholic drink and wine during the course of a pregnancy can in fact have a negative impact on the outcome of the birth of the child and could result in various types of defects. In verse 4 of Judges 13, it says, "Now therefore, please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, and not eat anything unclean." And so, you might look at that and you might say, what does that really have to do with anybody else? We understand the idea that it's just not smart, regardless of what you believe about alcohol. It's just not smart to partake in alcohol at a time when you're pregnant. Well, let's look a little bit further. We understand that being raised as a Nazirite, Samson was not to drink at all either. In Numbers chapter 6 and verse 2 and 3, it speaks of becoming a Nazirite. It says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when either a man or a woman consecrates an offering to take the vow of a Nazirite, to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and similar drink. He shall drink neither vinegar made from wine nor vinegar made from similar drink, neither shall he drink any grape juice nor eat fresh grapes or raisins." Now, as I look at that, there's a couple of key phrases that I think kind of can give us something to spin the wheels in our mind just a little bit. It says that when a man or a woman consecrates an offering to take the vow of a Nazirite, and then there's the phrase to separate himself to the Lord. So this idea of separating oneself to the Lord, I believe, is the same idea of what people today do when they are buried in the waters of baptism and they rise anew. They're not taking a Nazirite vow, as was the case in the Old Testament, but they are separating themselves out. They are making a vow to the Lord to serve him. And so this idea of when someone separated himself to the Lord, he was to separate himself from wine and similar drink. I believe we can look at that and we might ask ourselves, should that be the same today? Is that something that we might think can carry forward in our minds, that someone who separates himself to the Lord is someone who separates himself from wine and strong drink. At the very least, I think we can say there is value in avoiding strong drink altogether. Because if you never touch the alcohol, you never have to ask where the line may or may not be. Looking a little bit further here. Lesson number 4, we can find that true power is in the Lord and it is not in man. And it's interesting because those of us that have heard the account of the life of Samson, the strong man, and have heard about how the great strength that he has that comes from his hair, and it gives him this tremendous power, and he's able to do all of these amazing things. But let's take a look at what it says about how he is able to do these amazing things and where that power truly comes from. Samson's strength would come to him when the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. In each instance that we're going to see, you'll see that phrase. In Judges chapter 13, verses 24 and 25, it said, "So the woman bore a son, and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Menadan between Zorah and Eshtaol." So we see that the Spirit of the Lord begins to move upon this man, young man, Samson. Moving forward, in the 14th chapter and verse 6, we're told, "And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him," he being Samson, "and he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done." But again, notice that key phrase, "and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him." Where do we see his power coming from? Looking further in the 14th chapter at verse 19, it says, "Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house." So when did he find the strength to be able to kill 30 men by himself? When the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, according to that verse. Another instance in Judges the 15th chapter and verse 14, where the word of God says, "When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him." And here's our phrase, "Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with wire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands." When was he able to break free from the bonds and the ropes that were around him? When the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. So we can see that it is not in man's power of himself to do mighty things, but it is God who gives us the strength to do things. And we're familiar with the passage in the New Testament in Philippians which tells us, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." The fifth lesson that I think that we can pull from the account of the life of Samson is somewhat similar to the importance of marriage, but in this case, it's just the danger of influence of ungodly people in general. Not necessarily the person that you're going to choose to have as your spouse for the rest of your life, but just those people who are around you. Just those people that you spend time in contact with, and the danger that can come. Because it doesn't matter if it's your spouse, your family, or your friends, they will do anything they can to draw you to their way of thinking or acting. Let me give you an example. Judges chapter 16, verses 15 through 17. Then she, being Delilah, then she said to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies." And it came to pass, when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him, so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all his heart, and said to her, "No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." And notice how hard Delilah works in order to get him to answer a question that he does not want to answer. It is something that he does not want to share. And on 3 separate occasions, she's tried to get him to answer. And then it goes on to say in the verses, she pesters him daily and presses him. "How can you say I love you, but you won't tell me this thing?" And so finally, because she's willing to continue to go on and on and on, he finally gives in, and he finally tells her what he was trying to avoid. If we were to put that into a scenario that may exist today, you might hear someone say, "How can you say you're my friend, but you won't do XYZ? How can you say whatever it be, but you won't do whatever it be?" And so they will work and they will push and they will do anything they can to make you think the way they do. For instance, how can you say that a loving God can't accept homosexuality when that's the person I truly love? They will try to use those types of things in order to get you to come around. And the more influence that you have on that, and the more you have people in your ear all the time, day in and day out, much like she was, the more dangerous it becomes to you as an individual. And then lastly, I want to look at the idea of the danger of thinking we're walking with God, but are not. In Judges chapter 16, verses 20 and 21. And she, again being Delilah, she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." So he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Now think just a moment. We were just talking about every time he was able to do these things, the Spirit of the Lord came greatly upon him. Now we see he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. He thinks he can still do these things because he thinks the Lord is still with him. In verse 21 it says, "Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza, and they bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison." You see, because the Lord was no longer with him, he did not have the strength to overcome the Philistines as they came upon him. And so they were able to capture and imprison him. And I stop and think about this idea of, and wonder if we might at some point in our lives today think that we're walking with God, but we're not. And how scary that might be. And so I think it's very important for us to do everything we can to make sure that we are walking with him. I want to turn very quickly just to one of the 2 verses that you see on the bottom of your screen, and I want to kind of consider what that has to say very quickly in regards to walking with God. In John chapter 14 and verse 23 it says, "And Jesus answered and said to him, If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." So if we want God and Jesus to come to us and make their home with us, then we must make sure that we are keeping His word. And then we don't have to fear that we are walking without God. So, very quickly, let's sum up what we just looked at. What can we learn from the life of Samson? We can learn the importance and what a proper attitude toward God looks like. We saw that in his parents. We can learn the importance of choosing a spouse, as we saw in the discussion, and the concern that both his mother and his father had on whom he would choose to marry. We can see the importance of the value of avoiding strong drink, in that his mother, of course, was commanded not to, but also that a Nazirite set aside to the Lord was not to partake in any strong drink. We have learned that true power rests in the Lord and not in man. Samson's strength came from his obedience to God and what it is that God told him to do. It wasn't the hair in and of itself, it was the fact that he obeyed God by not cutting the hair. And we see how the power of the Lord came upon him mightily in every instance. We can see the danger of the influence of ungodly people and how they can and will do anything they can to change our way of thinking. And lastly, we can see that there's danger in thinking that we are walking with God, but are not. I hope that this particular study has given you some things to think about. Again, originally it was intended to be more of an individual character study, but as I go through and I look at what's taught in those 3 chapters, I found that this was a good source or a good tool for pulling some information out. And I encourage each of you to go back and to read in Judges chapters 13 through 16 for yourself and see what you can find and what you can learn on your own from the life of Samson. Thank you.